Chica. So I'm back, and this is the second in the little series on the purpose of phase 3. This is not about how to do phase 3. That is going to be other videos, and I'll link to those in the blog post if you want to learn, how to actually go about doing phase 3. This series is really about why it's important. What is the purpose? And it's important to know that so that we will take it seriously enough to follow through with it. It's kind of the phase that gets left behind or doesn't get as much attention, and as a result, a lot of people will end up gaining weight back from HCG because of not following phase 3. Really, if we take that part seriously, there's going to be a lot more success stories of people maintaining their weight loss. So there was basically 3 factors that I kind of thought of that have to do with why phase 3 is important. The first one was basically the main one, which is stabilizing your weight so that it stays about the same on a day-to-day basis. And we talked about that in the last video, and I'll link to that below if you haven't seen it. The second point, which is what we'll talk about right now, has to do with gradually eating larger amounts of food and also reintroducing fats gradually as well, and just other varieties in food groups over time, and readjusting your body to that. So I know that Dr. Simeons warned about not increasing your calories quickly enough on phase 3 and then running into trouble. The problem with what he said is that it's very vague. He doesn't give any indication of what that means. And sometimes when a statement's really vague and we're all gonna interpret it differently, it can almost be more hurtful than helpful because people take things in different ways when something is as vague as that. I've definitely suffered from the vagueness of that statement myself. I definitely would say that I jumped into P3 too quickly, most of my P3s, and I kind of managed to fix it and make it work out, but it made P3 more painful than it had to be. And just as an example of how we interpret things differently when our specifics aren't given, I used to read in a lot of fitness magazines how important a lot of protein was, like, oh, you need to eat a lot of protein, but since I wasn't reading specifics, in my mind, the way I translated that, it was like, here I am, 5'1", I weighed 120 pounds, or 125 pounds, and I'm packing away like a whole pound of meat after a workout, because I'm thinking, oh, I have to eat a lot of protein, but I'm a little person, and how much protein I need is totally different than like a 6'2" guy. So I don't need a whole pound of meat after a workout. But that's kind of how my mind processed it, just because of my own experiences in life or whatever. And over time I realized, like, oh, I don't need to eat that much meat per serving, but that's why, sometimes when things are vague, we can end up overdoing it because of that. So if we're not given clear direction, we can sometimes take things, too far one way or another, because we kind of simply just, don't naturally know what's balanced. So we'll just end up going whichever way, we may have gone based off of our previous experiences. So most of us have had an overeating problem prior to HCG. Some of us may have had undereating issues, but I think the majority of us, it's probably overeating. And, I think maybe in Dr. Simeons' day, perhaps it was different. Definitely a lot of women diet a lot, and that involves oftentimes lower calories and such. But, the issue with weight, especially in America, that more and more people are a lot, more and more overweight, is fairly widely known. And so it seems like overeating has really become more of the problem. So since we're coming from that perspective of overeating, we can easily jump into P3 too fast and add calories and fat and amounts of food too quickly. I've mentioned Robin Woodall's book, Weight Loss Apocalypse, a lot of times in my different videos, and I highly recommend it. There's a link to the book in this article. But I want to mention something that she said in regards to this. And remember that Robin has guided thousands of patients through the HCG protocol, and she's also been able to monitor their different levels. She has access to a lot more amenities in that regard than I do. But I wanted to mention something that she said on page 132 of her book. She says, without proper instruction, participants often cause physical harm and stress to their digestive system when immediately adding too much food with too much fat. Pancreatitis, dumping syndrome, which I have a link to what that is in the blog post, gallbladder inflammation, and flu-like symptoms are not uncommon consequences for participants who from extreme rigidity to comparative freedom. And you know, it really makes sense, doesn't it? P2 is so strict, there's very little food, there's no fat. And it's common knowledge that, you know, for instance, if you were to fast for numerous days in a row, when a person does that and then they reintroduce solid food again, you can't just sit down to a burger and fries. I mean, you could actually end up in the hospital if you did that, because your body adapts itself to whatever you're doing. And so when you break a fast, you have to be very careful about it. That's why they even recommend that you have medical supervision sometimes. You have to start with, you know, liquids and then liquefied food, and you just have to like do real gently break it in, you know, and eventually, you know, maybe get to the burger and fries. But it's well known that's how you need to carry those types of things out. Same thing if you've been a vegetarian for a period of time. If you decide to go back to eating meat, you can't just sit down and have, you know, a 16-ounce steak. You have to gradually reintroduce meat. You probably start with fish and then chicken and then graduate to beef at the end and then gradually increase the amounts. And it's really important to do that, or you will, you know, suffer some pretty nasty consequences, both with your digestion and your different organs as well. And that's okay. You just need to know that. That's all. And then you can do things gradually and be able to get back to eating, you know, what you were wanting to eat. So if we relate that to HCG now, you know, you've just spent 6 whole weeks. Your digestive system hasn't had to do much. 500 calories worth of food. You know, many people report constipation on the protocol, and a lot of it really has to do with just the fact that there's just not enough food coming through to stimulate the peristalsis of your intestines and all that stuff, you know. So it's just your digestive system's kind of had a break, and it's going to be a little sluggish at first. So, you know, if all of a sudden day 1 of P3, you know, you're eating a huge steak and like all this butter and you know, just a ton of food, like a huge amount of food, it's just, you're going to overwhelm your system, and you really don't need it either. But it could be a bad thing if you do that. And I know from experience. So like I said, I have tended to overdo P3 because I didn't know this information at the time. And also, you know, you get sick of P2 and you're just so excited to be eating again, and just, and I'd get overly full. I'd have horrible indigestion. It was awful. So I'm trying to spare you guys that pain. So what you want to do is gradually ease your body back into both larger amounts of food and fat, because remember, you haven't been taking fat in. Your body's been living off of your own fat stores. So your body hasn't been digesting a bunch of fats, you know, for a while either. So gradually we're introducing those so that your body can readapt to that again. I have actually linked to an article in the blog post that goes with this video that talks a little bit about why your body needs time to adapt to a change that you put it through. I thought it was really good. It actually had to do with vegetarians going back to eating meat and such like that, but the principle remains the same, and I thought it was very useful information, so you can check that out if you like. I actually have another good example just about how, you know, we need time to adapt and change. Even a person who's been eating a lot of processed foods, and say they decide all of a sudden to go, you know, eat raw, have a raw foods diet, same scenario. You actually, surprisingly, can't just go from, you know, McDonald's every day to eating all raw vegetables in large amounts. You will have the same type of indigestion, bloating, pain. You will. It's so totally crazy. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't eat healthy, obviously, totally. That's a great change to make. But again, it's something that you actually do need to ease into. I have an experience about that several years ago. I was on one of my kicks about how I was going to change my eating in my life, and those kicks never lasted too long until I did this protocol and kind of got serious and figured out what worked. But I decided, to like try to eat more raw vegetables, and so I ate several spears of like thick raw asparagus, like those really fat ones, and I'm like munching away. I don't know how many, it was like maybe 5 or 6. Oh my goodness. Later, like half an hour later, I had the worst stomach ache I've had in almost my entire life. It was horribly painful. And I didn't know what it was, and I just had no idea. I had no idea. It was, my body wasn't, it was just way too much like really thick, fibrous, raw vegetables that my body wasn't used to, you know. Same thing, you know, like kale. I don't know if you guys have heard me say this, but I actually eat a whole head of raw kale for a salad almost every day. But when I first started eating kale, and you know, I have a kale salad P3 recipe video, right? So someone messaged me and was like, I tried the kale salad, but my tummy really didn't feel too good. And I was like, oh man, I should have warned you guys. Same type of thing. Don't start off with a whole head of kale. You know, have a little bit, let your body adjust to, you know, processing and digesting that type of roughage, and then your body will adapt, and you'll be able to eat it more freely. And I love my kale salads, man. I'm telling you, pretty much a whole head of kale almost every day. I have it with pine nuts and dried cranberries and dressing, and when I eat it now, the thing that I love about it is that I literally feel the same before and after I eat the salad. Meaning, you know, usually when you eat food, you get a little bit sleepy or lethargic after eating a meal. I never feel that way with my kale salad. It's one of the only foods that I can eat that I will feel just as energetic and clear-headed after I've eaten. And it could be a huge bowl. I mean, a whole head of kale. That's a lot of food. But yeah, it's like as if my body just loves it. It doesn't require a lot of energy for it to digest, I guess, anymore, because it's used to it, and it just feels good. So, but again, you could just see why even going to a healthier way of living, you've got to still gradually introduce things and adjust your body to it. So you can kind of tell when you read Pounds and Inches that Dr. Simeons was concerned about people who were so nervous about P3 that they would maybe try to keep eating the 500 calories once they were off HCG because they were afraid of gaining weight. So it seemed like that's why he was kind of trying to counteract people like that by telling them, no, you need to increase your calories. But he didn't go into as much detail about, how much you should eat on P3. And it seems like, portion sizes have gone up a lot since he wrote the book back in the 1950s or whatever. So again, we're in that place now where we tend to, when someone says to do something quickly, we do it too quickly. Or when someone says to do a large amount of something, we make the amount too large, because that's just our perspective from where we're at. And I am really the perfect example of that mistake. I've kind of already said it, but I did overdo P3 on more than one occasion. I had indigestion. It was too much food, so I would have gains on the scale because I was just eating too much. The whole point is really that we eat to hunger, which Robin Woodall talks about elegantly in her book. And so really for me to be eating so much food that maybe might have been okay once I got to P4, but when you're coming off of a diet of 500 calories, you're not going to be hungry for 5 times that many calories day 1 of P3. You're just not. So it really does make more sense to gradually introduce calories. Now, I'm not a calorie counter, and you're probably not going to see any of my articles talk about specific amounts of calories to consume on phase 3. So I'm sorry if you guys are disappointed by that, but I just don't know a lot about that. I don't even really believe in the whole basal metabolic rate thing. I find I can eat a lot more than that if I eat the right foods and all of that. So for me, it's more about amounts of food, judging how you feel hunger-wise, which really makes more sense to go by that. I think that's a better indicator. Not getting overly full, but not being hungry, eating so that you're not hungry, you know, and that's really a good way to approach phase 3. And what you'll find is that if you do that, when you start phase 3, you just actually won't need a lot of food at first. And hopefully by listening to your body like that, you won't have as much fluctuation on the scale in phase 3, you know, at that start. Hopefully it will even out faster if you can pay attention to that. And then as phase 3 goes on, you'll find that you may be hungrier for more, your body can handle more food, and so it will be appropriate at that time, and it will work out well that way. The last thing I wanted to talk about in regards to this topic has to do with adding fats back into the diet. Now initially when I was doing my P3s, I would just, you know, start phase 3 with whatever, bacon, eggs with butter, whatever. And I kind of just started figuring out that, you know, I think my body is still pretty sensitive to fats at the beginning of phase 3. I could be wrong about this, I don't know. Robin talks about the need to add fats back in because of your organs and giving your organs time to adjust to digesting fat again. So that's one really good reason not to just add a ton of fat right away. But even outside of that, I felt like even though the HCG was out of my system, I felt like my body would have a much higher gain from, you know, too much fat on a certain day in phase 3 just at the start than other foods. And I mean, I could be wrong, but I'm telling you, like, you know, I remember one P3, my husband made this totally awesome lamb stew. It's like he made the broth from the lamb neck bones, and there was like, you know, all this lamb stew meat, but lamb is notoriously really high in fat, right? So it's like the soup had like this thick layer of like oil on the top, you know, and I'm like scarfing it down, like, oh, this is so good, you know, but I did feel a little weird. And then my weight went up, I think like 3 pounds the next day, probably salt as well, you know, for sure, water retention. But I just really, over and over, I have seen that my body was still sensitive to fats, like the first week of P3. So another thing to just definitely keep in mind is add fats in gradually. I really think that that's a good idea. I know it can seem like there's just so many rules to this, but you really do want to think of phase 2 as like an extension of phase 3. It is easier in a sense in the, you know, that you have more variety and more choices, but you still want to be really cautious about gradually introducing stuff. Because I really think the people who do that, they have an easier P3. I've interviewed quite a few people. In fact, I'm going to show you an interview with Barbara who did that, and she gradually introduced calories in foods, and people who do that, they have those very easy, smooth phase 3s. And you know, that's what I would like for you guys. It was very disconcerting to be having those wild fluctuations where my weight would just shoot up, and then I'd be panicking and trying to figure out what I did wrong, because I always was very strict about no starches, no sugars. I mean, that rule, I was strict about it, you know, and I was pretty good about doing steak days too. But, you know, the steak day is more of like a correction measure, right? You know, you're hoping to not have to do one. If you have to, fine, but I was strict with no starches and no sugars, but that wasn't enough. I was eating too much, too fast, and too much fat too fast. So those are the other things that if you can be more gradual about it, in general, I find the people who do that stabilize out much more easily. So that's it for point number 2. Stay tuned for the next video. We're going to talk about the third point in regards to the purpose of phase 3, which has to do with discovering food sensitivities that you might have that you weren't aware of before that could be making it difficult for you to stabilize your weight. So we'll talk about that in detail in the next video. All right, you guys, you can find me on Instagram, HCGChica, Facebook, HCGChica. And that's the places I hang out the most. And of course, my blog, hCGChica.com. There's tons of free help and info on there for you. And anyway, yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.